Hey, Quat.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to present?
Yes, please. Because I'm on another meeting. I can't.
That's fine. So I don't have slides. I just have the doc on GitHub. For some reason, I no longer can create docs in the community drive. I don't know what happened, but it's very difficult to publish if you work at Google these days. So I wanted to discuss this issue. Yeah, I don't want to use my personal email. Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to discuss this topic that was brought up a few weeks ago, which is essentially, I want to, the proposal is for Ambient to use workload discovery service to get the metadata about the peers. And that would be a replacement for the baggage header that was originally in the prototype. And let me so give you some background. When we populate metrics in Istio for the HTTP Istio request total, we have to also collect metadata data about peers, things like namespaces, names, deployments, and so on, for both source and destination. And in the sidecar Istio, this metadata is populated by sending a HTTP header on every request. So when we moved to the ambient world, we did the same thing, but instead we used the baggage header, and we also attached it to the connect request, not the inner HTTP request within the connect. So the design is basically the same, and the reason and why we think it was not good enough is the same reason why it's not good enough in sidecars. And I listed a couple of the requirements that it doesn't really give us. So one of the issues with that approach is the fact that we have to send it on every request. So that for the short connect requests, the size of the payload can be significant. If you have very short HTTP request, the overhead is a few kilobytes, and we notice that people observe this increase in payload sizes, and they don't really like it because it also increases their network ingress and egress costs, even when they don't use telemetry. So that it's not that they will be fine if it was just if they use the telemetry, but in many cases users don't even want to use telemetry and they still pay the price on the data path. And that's a flaw, because I think we should be striving for a design where you'll only pay for the features that you use. So if you don't care about Istio telemetry, things like Istio request total, you should not have any additional overhead. The second requirement that this doesn't really, this design didn't support well, is the fact that it changes the protocol to be Istio specific. What I mean by that is that if you wanna join the mesh, you now have to send this baggage header. Otherwise, our features degrade. And that's problematic because now for any proxy or any SDK that wants to be part of the mesh, not only they have to implement the HTTP connect and MTLS, they also have to implement the baggage header, which is a big ask. And because as far as I know, this is not yet a standard, so none of the SDKs come with it by default. So that means they have to implement it in code, and that's a big problem for many of them. At least we know that from the gRPC experience, because gRPC today, if you have a gRPC-based mesh, if you want to join the Istio-based sidecar mesh, our telemetry degrades, partly because gRPC doesn't send this header. And the fourth problem is the fact that it's completely untrusted, because when the source sends its baggage header, it can say whatever it wants in the baggage, and we will collect telemetry and emit telemetry, and we never verify. That means it can be surprising if you have untrusted sources on the edge. They can basically, they can affect your telemetry in subtle ways. For example, by exploding cardinality or by sending things that you would you can be basically misguided, and that's a flaw. Right. So the problem with baggage header is not just it's a baggage itself is a standard, but the content of the baggage that we defined is not standard at all.
I'm not sure that's quite true. There is a standard in OTel, but it's experimental.
Right. And we have a lot of extensions, things like canonical service and things that are not even part of OTel.
It's actually defined in W3C, not, OTel is, I think, adopting the W3C definition, but for telemetry, they define some labels, and OpenTelemetry defines some canonical labels as well, but they are not exactly what we are using. They're quite different.
Right. I also want to mention that this baggage method is not the only one we use. There's also TCP-based method, and there's a...
We also the legacy method, right? And
yeah, but we still, those are legacy methods. So what the proposal is about is really, so instead of having all those tier-based methods where the client sends you stuff, or the method is sprinkled in the standard XDS, we actually have a dedicated XDS for metadata. And so what that means is that if you want to retrieve, sure, go ahead, can interrupt.
Yeah, so Quat, so this XDS-based method, you are proposing a new XDS service to get the peer metadata information. So this is not something existing, right? This will be a new XDS.
So it's kind of both. It exists in Ambient already, because this workload discovery is a core component of Ambient mesh. There's additional XDS in Ambient, if you're not aware, which has all the metadata.
So this will be upstream to Envoy, become part of XDS.
So the question whether you're going to go to upstream is I think it's a separate thing. I think right now I'm just concerned about Istio and how we do it in Istio.
Okay.
I think we can also extend it to be in general, XDS for all Envoy meshes, but I think it's a bit more ambitious right now.
Yeah, because you mentioned the gRPC and a few broader scope. So I think, for interoperability, if it's a part of the Envoy standard, then I guess it will improve the interoperability in service mesh.
Yeah, so let me just add here a bit more. So the reason it's specifically metadata discovery service is really it's an Istio implementation. If we were to do it for gRPC, we would probably do it a different way, which is to use OTel processor. So we would implement it as a part of OTel pipeline, where we substitute headers, substitute certain attributes with other attributes. Does that make sense? Or
is it possible that gRPC and Envoy share the same metadata discovery service? Or what's the technical reason they have to be different?
The technical reason is that this is workload discovery service is a very ambient API right now. And if you want to make it more general, we need a bit more discussion how to make it supported in gRPC, in OTel collector, OTel processor, and other deployments. It requires a bit more genericity, right, in the API.
Okay.
So essentially, what the idea here is that we don't want to touch sidecar because it compromises the safety of what we have. But for Ambient, we have an opportunity to get away from the using headers and instead switch to a more OTel-like pipeline where you have a separate processor phase. So what we do is, instead of trying to collect it on the data path, we do a lookup during the pipeline during telemetry pipeline. And because we have to do this lookup in Envoy to emit Istio metrics, we are using WDS, which is the workload discovery service. But if we didn't have to emit Istio request total, we could just not do that lookup and let hotel populate the attributes somewhere down the pipeline. Does that make sense, or?
So the metadata will be part of the workload data, workload discovery service, a part of the, I mean, it is part of the response from the workload discovery service, or it's a separate?
So what we need to support on a data path is the ability to find the workload, a key to the workload. Essentially saying, this is the peer identified by some key, and this is the local identified by some key. We don't need all the metadata. Right now, we send all the metadata, but that's onerous. And this proposal essentially to limit that to only be about the key, so that your data path is lighter. You can support more proxies and more SDKs, and to backfill the rest of metadata with a lookup.
And the lookup is through the key for workload.
Right. So the lookup can happen in Envoy using metadata discovery service, because we already have that in Ambient, so we can easily use it. But it can also happen in Hotel. It can happen in the other Hotel implementations. I mean, we have open source Hotel collector that already has something like this. It just doesn't work for the both peer and destination, but it only works for the local resource. I have a link down there, which is there's a thing called Hotel Kubernetes Attribute Processor. What this does essentially backfills attributes based on some key, but the key has to be part of the resource. So the issue is that it's a resource attribute. While for Istio, we want to both have source and destination, not just resource. But sorry, there's not a single way to do it, right? So the proposal is really to make it more extensible, and the way to do it to support Istio request total as it is now is to do this processing in Envoy using WDS, but it can also be done in Hotel using a Hotel collector processor, so that Envoy doesn't have to do anything.
Okay, Quat. So one suggestion: if you can add a detailed workflow diagram, that will help us understand the detailed workflow much better. Yeah, I think I get the high-level idea, but there are some details.
Yeah, sorry, it's just a trouble creating documents. Yeah, John, you had a hand for a while.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand how, say I'm a client, I just don't get the flow of how we eventually get telemetry reported. I make a request to some workload. How do I get that information? I guess I can look up in the workload discovery thing, but what is the key that I use there?
Yeah, so if you're on the client, right now we always preserve IP on destination. So we just use remote IP.
What if it's going through a network gateway, for example?
Then we need to have some kind of header identifying the destination. We don't have this mode, right? I mean, yes, I understand the workflow. For example, you could have thing where you make requests to zTal and have a header saying, destination desired pod name / pod namespace, and then the key becomes pod name namespace.
Who decides that though? The client?
The client
reports who they want?
Well, the client has to know where it wants to connect to, right? So it uses whatever identify information for the destination as the key.
Yeah, but the client may not know the specific pod that it wants. It may just know the service, right? But the metadata is actually a workload.
Well, then it has to report. Well, it's gonna resolve to some IP, or it's gonna be part of the. So I think the HBOM protocol has to support the resolved IP as a header.
So I think we discussed it in the past. I mean, it's some ways the client will need to know the peer IP, And from that, we can derive this information one way or another. It doesn't matter how it is passed, I mean, to original preserving source address, AJ proxy headers, X-forwarding for. I mean, we have plenty of metadata servers that we discussed in the past, but it's a core requirement for a client to know what is IP address of the server is talking about.
Right.
But
I mean, it
if-
should right. It
If
should
it's
look
not
like
the
a.
client
Sorry.
picking. Sorry to interrupt. Actually, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
Well, I mean, it should be a requirement for our ambient to preserve TCP semantics. So you have to know what destination is somehow, right?
Well, I don't think you necessarily know the final destination. Like when I connect to google.com, I just know the VIP for google.com. I don't know the Borg IP address, right? But I want. So like my concern is if we. I agree that in a normal deployment, you do know all the IP addresses, actually. That part's fine. But I know there are some folks that have split brain control planes where they only know about their own cluster or network. And they kind of delegate the choice of the actual pod IP later. So in those cases, like I suppose we could have the server report back in the response header what its IP address is. But then we're kind of back to the untrusted world, right? Where they could say whatever IP they want.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can say whatever IP it wants because it's a gateway. So gateway, you have to trust gateway, right?
So the gateway is untrusted. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but the gateway is not fully trusted for the multi-network.
Well, the gateway is responding on behalf of the backend. So if you trust gateway, you have to trust gateway if you trust backend, right? I mean, it's the same level of trust.
You have the end-to-end TLS to the actual backend. You trust the gateway to get you to the backend, but then you verify the TLS certificate of the actual backend, right? So
yeah,
if
so
it's the wrong service,
I mean, it's not different than using IPs today. I mean, they're not really trusted. So if you want more trusted, you have to put it in the TLS cert, and that's also an option. It's just we don't support that right now in Istio.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like it could give you like the one thing that we know is the certificate, right? That's the only trusted information actually. And so you could say, hey, they said that their IP address 1234, and I looked at that IP address and their identity doesn't match their certificate, so it's wrong. And then we at least know that they didn't lie about their identity part, right? So they could have impersonated like a sibling workload in the same identity, but you don't really gain that much from that impersonation, right? So we have a bit more verification than we do today.
So that all makes sense, and actually that's the whole point with proposals, that we have to make it explicit what the backend is. Right? We need to know at the protocol level who you're talking to, because right now it's implicit because we just send baggage. Somebody somewhere fills up the baggage, but we have to support the just a regular key for the destination workload, regardless of telemetry.
So one thing I want to point out is that it's not an exclusive. We're not saying that metadata discovery service will be the only way you get peer metadata. Always when you do telemetry analytics on this kind of stuff, you use the set of data points. You may use information of certificate, you may use baggage, you may use DNS reverse lookups, like it has been done for 20 years when analyzing the access logs. And you have this extra tool, which is MDS, which is already something that we support for Ambient, where you can also get details about the peer by either IP or pod name. So and it's basically going to be a kind of pick the best information, most trustworthy information from the set that you have. If it is a certificate, obviously that's the most trusted.
Well, it seemed like one of the goals was to avoid the overhead of baggage. So would we, I guess if it's in the certificate, you might know that from the TLS handshake, but you don't know if the server needs the baggage though, right? So I don't know if we'd be able to avoid that overhead, right?
Well, if you use Ambient, so you use WDS anyway, the metadata discovery service anyway, so you kind of got the information on you as a client, you try to get the server information.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily know if the server knows your information. So you kind of have to send baggage optimistically, right?
Well, it is not a great issue. You shouldn't be sending baggage to arbitrary destinations. That's actually a big issue in Istio, is that people complain that we're leaking cluster details outside of the world. I don't think it's a good feature. Like if you don't know where destination is, you shouldn't send stuff about the cluster.
Well, if you're doing H1 though, then you inherently know. Like you could still argue very much that you should be able to connect to someone without telling them more information than just your identity. But at least if we're just saying we only do it on the H1 baggage, like we only send H1 to known destinations. So we wouldn't send it to google.com at least. And at that point, you're already at least sending your certificate info, which has some metadata.
Well, the certificate info is to authenticate. It's not leaking information like pod labels.
Sure, but I mean, the certificate info is not that much more than what's in this workload struct, right? Like you already have the namespace service account. Yeah, you're missing a few other things, but it seemed like the main concern with that was that we're leaking to like google.com, not to other things that we consider to be in the mesh. But maybe there's use cases there that I'm not aware of.
The problem is that you can view baggage as identifying information. It's just it's several kilobytes worth of obscure data that comes with every request, and that's the issue really. It's just it's fine to have a limited information that identifies you, but having all of it sent always is a problem.
So is the trust we are talking about the trust for the control plane? Because the metadata information is, since it's SDS, right? So the the metadata information coming from the control plane, right?
Yeah,
so if you get your config from control plane, then you have to trust the metadata you get from control plane, right? So
this proposal is actually strictly better in terms of trust.
Okay.
Because in the best case is you get a pod name and pod namespace from the certificate, and then you look up using control plane. So all of it is trusted.
Okay. So similar to how the client provides the node ID to control plane, so the client will provide the metadata to control plane, right?
Right.
And
so it will just provide the trusted kind of node ID that the destination can use to look up the rest of information.
I see. Okay.
But the trusted part's not a unique key to get the rest of the information, right? The only trusted part's the identity, and identity is not a unique key for.
We have a bit of flexibility. So yes, right now it has to be IP because that's what Ambient supports. But you can imagine you have a per pod certificate. In that case, you can just use a pod name, which is
if we change the certificate scheme, then yes. Like I think as it is today with the current certificates, the only things that can ever be trusted attributes are service account, trust domain, and namespace, right?
Actually, we have pod name in GKey certificate, so we'll have that. We just don't use it.
And there is a proposal for Kubernetes and we discussed this before to have pod everywhere, not only on GKey, and probably other certificate providers can include it like GKey does.
There's a subtle issue of delegation because when zTalent connects, right now it presents certificate, but it has to tell about the X404. So it's a bit of a weird thing because we trust the X404 more than the certificate. But I think it can be resolved in the future. It would be better if zTalent had a separate identity so you can trust it to delegate rather than trust every single workload to delegate. So I have to.
One thing I want to understand, so like in Envoy and whatnot, we'll use the workload XDS, but you mentioned OTel collector could augment this data with their like processing thing. I forget what the correct naming is. Attribute processor. What does it use? Like, would it still use the IP address? Because we, at least today, like we don't, like nowhere in the telemetry is an IP address, right?
So if we use the OTel processor, yes, we'll just send the IP address, I think. As
okay, so you would send
and then
the
you
IP
erase it.
address,
Yeah.
it would replace the IP address with the metadata, and then okay.
So the one that already out there is limited. It doesn't have everything we need, but it's very similar to what we want. Just need to
Yeah.
extend its capability.
Because if we were to use like, I mean, one of the goals was it's easier for things to interop. If we don't adopt OTel fully and do, kind of the custom OTel processor, then I think this actually makes it harder, because I would imagine it's easier to stick a header with some information about yourself than to connect to XDS, right? That's like a non-Istio first-party client, right?
Well, I think you always have to send identify information. It's just right now we raise it because it hurts cardinality and telemetry. But if we didn't care about cardinality, we could just put the pod name as a label, right? And the hotel thing, yes, hotel collector, it's designed for this kind of.
So I mostly meant like if you were using just like plain Prometheus, for example, not hotel, and you wanted to join the mesh. Like we said, one of the goals was to make it easier for things to interoperate with the mesh. I would think that requiring you to connect to XDS to get telemetry is harder than just sticking.
Yeah. So right now, we only need this WDS to support Istio legacy, metrics.
Yeah.
In the future, we might just not have this and just send pod name and pod IP or pod IP as a label to the collector.
I see. Okay.
So we're going to put some comment on the thread, but I mean, the XDS is what Istio is using and how we configure and communicate information, but the root of the information is still what the pod watcher and whatever we get from Kubernetes. And any non-Istio, non-XDS application can connect to Kubernetes or use whatever protocols, because the source of truth is not XDS, it's Kubernetes.
Yes, but it's a bit more complicated when we consider a mesh, because a lot of the information is outside of Kubernetes, right? Multi-cluster, multi-network, VMs. Well,
VMs we registered to Kubernetes. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit more complicated, but not something that's unique to Istio or that cannot be done by an independent mesh implementation with its own mechanism.
Well, you could get some of it, yeah, but you're not going to have necessarily all the information about all IPs connecting to you. I mean, even in Istio, that's not really true necessarily, that any one control plane knows about all these IP addresses, right? I think there was something about like federating between the control planes, but it would be something that needs to be scoped out more, I think.
Yeah, analytics is not, again, exact science or determinism, not security. I mean, we're talking telemetry, not security.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, bring it back to the what things we need to do, right? What can we do? So I think we should. It would be better if Ambient in the first version didn't have baggage as a requirement for the protocol. I think that would allow more options in both implementations and protocols. But and we can do it if we use this option. And then the second point is that we also need to be very explicit about how we identify workload, just like John mentioned. We need to define what the service sends to identify the destination if it's behind the gateway. And similar on the client, we need to send the X44 from the tunnel. So if we do those two things, we can. So if we use metadata discovery service in Ambient only, and we also send the identify information as headers, not the whole baggage. I think we can use this for the initial Ambient version.
So Quad, for the identifier, what kind of format or standard are you going to use? SPIFFE ID or whatever? What's a proposal?
Oh, all of Ambient is now IP based, so I would suggest using IPs. I mean, zTunnel uses IP, so I think we should just use IPs.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, IP is the most pragmatic choice because that's what we use, but I think we definitely need to consider pod ID because it's a stable identifier and we have it in the certificate. I mean, we should have both, but prefer to use pod ID whenever it's available.
John mentioned that zTunnel spoofs the source IP, which I think is also not necessarily a good thing because we can't reuse the tunnel. So either way, I think we just need to be clear for what we are going to do in the first version. But the key is basically we need to, on the source, we need to send the actual source IP, and on destination, we need to send the actual destination IP. And if we have those two bits of information, we can look up in WDS and fill up the rest of metadata. And for the questions point, it's already implemented. It's just not enabled.
Yeah. By the way, on this whole how do we propagate, let's not forget that beside Istio telemetry, applications themselves may integrate with OpenTelemetry or other things. And the applications themselves may need this kind of information, I mean, source IP, client IP. So I think we need to merge John's metadata information PR or some other mechanism to allow applications to get access to the information when necessary.
You mean expose metadata discovery source to applications, or?
Yeah, no. John had a PR to have zTunnel expose a kind of a metadata HTTP-based lookup service, and in the past we discussed even implementing the AJ proxy protocol. So, as an application, if I do my own telemetry for myself, I may need to have the same requirements that I know the peer.
Yeah, sure. It's you can use just HTTP XDS version.
Yeah.
The intent, well, I mean, you could do that. The alternative that Cox was mentioning is it calls to zTunnel actually instead of to Istio. Because zTunnel's no local, right? So it's a bit easier to do like a metadata server type thing.
You can call Istio if zTunnel preserve IP, source IP, but in some CNI providers apparently it's not possible. For example,
Well, I mean, like each workload connecting to Istio is a big difference from calling zTunnel, right? Like you need to then have authentication, know where zTunnel or know where Istio is, all these other things, and more load on Istio.
No, I agree. I was thinking more like exposing in the DNS interception or some other if we do DNS, but because it's very high overhead to have workloads connect to XDS.
I mean, you really want to look up in Kubernetes, so you should just make a call to Kubernetes, and then we trust our back on Kubernetes to disclose or not disclose this.
What we were thinking is that the application gets a connection and they send a request that says, what is the information about this connection to zTunnel? So,
well, for the data path purposes, all we care is IPs, right? You just care about source and destination. The tuple. You don't really care about put source labels, right? I mean, that's something that shouldn't be trusted always. Something that should be explicitly open in.
But today, as an application, you can't even get the peer identity, right? Which is actually the one piece of trusted information.
Right. I think that then it's a separate problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what Kostin is saying is actually a different problem. Because for waypoints, we use HBone, so we always know identity.
No, we're talking about the actual applications, though. They see nothing other than the raw data, but they don't know anything about the source.
Yeah, so I think in that case, I think the lookup should disclose the identity, but and not the rest. And the rest is sort of a separate thing.
I see.
So I don't know what you should be doing at this point. I mean, I wanted to discuss it right now. I don't think we need to make a decision. So, but it'd be nice if we supported this, I think. So I don't know who should be making the call. We can also, I mean, as Kostin said, we can just not send baggage and just have both methods. But I think it's just too many ways.
Yeah, I generally hate options, but I think baggage. I mean, if we can auto discover or do something, but I don't think we should start remove baggage yet, since tracing and other things probably still need baggage. But definitely we should implement this as well, because it's. I mean, the trust aspect is, I think, very important to me at least.
Yeah, one note on the first launch discussion. The branch trees for 1.18 is in 6 days. So it's probably not many changes that we can make. But we've also committed that we're not stuck on compatibility for the initial launch. So we can very well make a very big breaking change in 7 days if we want to, without, having to worry about compatibility.
The code is there. It's just not used. So I don't think we don't need to implement much at this point. We just need to enable it.
Some background data point. I've been also talking with gRPC IO team, which also supports, as you know, XDS and mesh, and they are also looking at how to pass metadata, and they may use baggage. I don't know if they are. I mean, probably we need to discuss with them if the same metadata discovery service is acceptable to them, or if they want to adopt it. But I think it's important to work with external groups to standardize, to have a common protocol with them.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like the problem with protocol is that if they still send a baggage, they'll probably send a half field baggage. So somewhere down the line, we'll have to use something like meta discovery service to backfill anyways. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds, right? But I'll need to talk to them. I don't know who that is. So if you can send me.
Mark, I'll send you contact.
Yeah.
So Quad, this will be also introduced to Istio, right? This is not an ambient specific thing, right?
I think it would be not safe to add it to sidecars yet.
Okay.
So it's only ambient.
But waypoints will have it. What?
So it's just waypoints basically in ambient.
Okay.
And then I mean, zTunnel already does this. So this is not actually new. It's just we're doing the same thing in waypoint. Yeah, just another related to that using source IP. And so another problem with baggage is that it prevents sharing of the tunnel. So the less stuff we can have on the HBone HTTP connect request, the more likely we can share it. So it's not.
Isn't each HBone request? I mean, the baggage is per HTTP stream, not per connection, and each stream is per user connection. So the sharing is at a different level, I thought.
The sharing happens at the TCP level, right? So if you have to create a new TCP connection to change the baggage.
We don't though. The baggage is you can have different baggages over one TCP connection because the baggage is associated with the HTTP2 stream, not the TCP connection.
It's associated to the HTTP2 connect stream.
Right, and that's one-to-one with the user's connection.
Right, so it requires you to establish a new connection if you want to change a header.
No, we can have one TCP connection with two HTTP2 streams with different baggage headers.
Yeah, we're just talking about different TCP connections. Yes, you have one TCP TLS connection, but you have multiple TCP HTTP2 streams, right, within them.
Yeah, but that's determined by the user's connection, so we can't merge the user's TCP connections, right?
There is overhead in HTTP2 stream management. So
I
the
know,
less
but we
pins-
don't choose the amount of them. The user chooses that based on their own application of establishing connections.
Yeah, it can be as many as you want, but it's more efficient if you have less of them. And
But
for
we
gateways,
don't choose that though. Like the application, the user's application does.
zTunnel chooses it.
No, it does not. We have the users. The user opens a connection. For each connection they open, we open a HTTP2 stream. It's one-to-one mapping, and it's driven by the user. It may be a bit different in the waypoint case, actually, because the waypoint's doing its own HTTP connection pooling and load balancing. So I think that's a bit different. But for zTunnel, it's strictly driven by the client, which is the application that we don't touch, right?
Yes. So for any pooled
Yeah, yeah. For
applications,
waypoint, you're right. Yeah, I was thinking only zTunnel.
like gRPC or Envoy, you have a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so if you're doing L7 pooling type thing, then yes, I agree. Actually, I was only thinking of the other case.
Well, I don't have anything else. So if there's no more questions, I think we can stop. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I'll stop.
Does anyone else have any topics? All right. If not, then let's call it good for today. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.